There we go. Thanks. All right. Welcome, everybody, to another session of Lab Live. We're going to kick things off today. We have myself, Bill Allen, as well as Corey Green in the house. We are going to be showing you guys today how to do interoperability with a few different tools. We're going to be looking at FormIt, Grasshopper, SketchUp, Revit, looking at how all of these things kind of interact together. So with that, we're going to go ahead and get started. First off, Corey, can you tell everybody a little bit about yourself? What's your background? What's your jam? What did you used to do? What are you doing at Evolve Lab?
Yeah, sure. So I'm the Director of Strategy here at Evolve Lab, which means I get to talk with our clients about how they're actually going to implement the new technologies that they're pursuing or that we're able to support them with. So I'm coming from a background in design, more specifically at architectural firms, one in Chicago and some other locations around the country. I was a BIM consultant for a matter of years before I went and worked with a co-working firm. I had a hot second at a capital management group, and then I joined Evolve Lab to help with this idea of how does the data-driven design start to translate to all aspects of the building supply chain and how that translates to owners, architecture firms, GCs, everyone who's involved in delivering a building. And that's really what I get to do on a day-to-day basis here, is help firms that we're consulting with figure out how does design technology propagate throughout the rest of the building cycle.
That's awesome. Super, really good intro. I like it. Can I ask, what kind of design tools did you use, like, in your background? Are you using Revit, SketchUp, Rhino? Like, what was kind of your jam when you were using some of these design tools before you were at Evolve Lab?
Sure. So I was always heavily dependent on Rhino as a form finder, specifically Rhino and Grasshopper, and then all the time I'd be having to interface with other people who'd be working with SketchUp. More recently I've gotten into the form finding and sort of design development with the massing and the different tools native to Revit, but it was almost always this exercise, and this really painful of exercise, going from one platform to another, because you lose integrity of the information, but more importantly you lose a lot of your time and end up spending a lot of late nights doing double work that's just not necessary. So the interoperability challenge has kind of been around for a very long time, and it's good to start to see all these solutions coming together right now.
So I like it. Awesome. A little bit more about the rest of our team. So Corey and I are on the team, but it's not just us. We have a whole, what we like to call a neuro network of knowledge. So we have Sean that's on the team. Daniel, everyone always confuses him as my brother. He's not related to me. We have Daniel Cortez, Cassie, yourself, we mentioned, Jake, as well as Juge. Always really, really strong talent. These guys are incredible. Probably one of the things I'm most excited about is just having to be able to lean on a lot of these team members because they're super, super smart, which I really appreciate. So anytime you guys have any questions, thoughts, anything like that, please reach out to them because they're super smart individuals. With that, we want to also know who you guys are. So we have in the chat window, we always want to keep that thing live and going. And so what we want to know is who you guys are. Maybe tell us who you are and maybe which firm you're with. We'd love to know that. And then as we're going, Corey's going to be fielding questions. So anytime you guys have a question, he's going to be going through those and bringing those to my attention, as well as kind of moderating that. So Corey's going to be handling that piece. So fill up the chat window. We look like we have about 47 people watching right now. So we should have about 47 people commenting in there as far as who you guys are and where you guys work at. And while you guys are doing that, we're going to talk about some of our, what I like to call our edutainment objectives. So we're going to be educating while entertaining. So don't want this super dry, don't want it boring, but you guys also are here to learn. So it's edutainment. We're going to be looking at a few different workflows. We mentioned FormIt to Revit. We're going to be looking at Grasshopper to Revit, SketchUp to Revit, and then we're going to be looking at some of these different tools that have existed in the past, and then maybe some of them you didn't know about, specifically bringing like a family into a Revit Mass family into Revit and how you could use that, or do you use FormIt, and then also where some of the bidirectionality happens with some of those. So we'll go ahead and jump in here.
Can you give us a headline as to why you chose those three other authoring softwares?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So we definitely could be talking about ArchiCAD. We could be talking about AutoCAD. What I have found is that these are some of the most common design and documentation tools. So it's 2019 now as an industry. I think most firms are getting into Revit if they're not already. And then most firms are either using SketchUp or Rhino or, those tools to be able to translate over to Revit, like the SketchUp and Rhinos of the world to get them over to Revit. And so, plus, we only have a limited amount of time. We could look at all tools, but I think these are the ones that are most relevant to, I would say, 90% of the firms. So, the other thing to mention is if you guys are interested, Cassie's been crushing it, by the way. Shout out to her. Huge following on LinkedIn and Twitter and Facebook. But these are some of the Twitter handles. If you guys want to be following this or publishing anything, you guys can use these as an example to tag us in there. So with that, I'm curious, who do we have joining us? We have a few people that...
It sounds like we have a lot of people coming from architectural firms, either as BIM practice managers or designers themselves. Really pretty wide range from across the U.S. And I'm not sure if I've seen anyone international, but I've seen some definitely international firms. Combination of interior and architectural designers as well as some engineers. So a pretty broad spectrum of people signed up today.
I love it. This is good too. There's a bunch of people that I know personally. So shout out to Michael over at Boulder Associates as well as Brian. There's a whole bunch of people in here that we know personally and are friends with. So really appreciate you guys jumping on, as well as many of those that we don't know yet. Looking forward to getting to know you guys. The other question I had for the group, because we were talking about why are we picking some of these tools? The other question I had for everyone is, how many of you guys are using something other than Revit for design? And if you are, what are you using? So just say you guys are using SketchUp and Rhino, or say that you're using Dynamo or Grasshopper. It'd be really good to know what other tools you guys are using beyond Revit, because I want to know selfishly. I think it would be really good. So maybe put that in the chat window and we'll keep going. But I want to keep this kind of interaction going. So while you guys are populating that, I'm going to talk about the problem. So the problem that exists is what I've been coining as this model drop chasm. And so in here, and of course we're right on it. I wonder, we'll do this. There, you can read the model drop chasm. Note to self, test the PowerPoint before you do the video. So this is the model drop chasm right there behind us. And so what happens is you typically go from a project planning stage through schematic design, design development, and there's this window between schematic design and design development where you've done all of your Rhino modeling or your SketchUp modeling, typically most firms, and then you're going to go, great, now we got to get it over to Revit. And I personally, from working in architecture for about 12 years, was the recipient of a lot of these SketchUp models and had to Revitize them. And so I was become obsessed with this idea of this model drop chasm, and a huge waste of time that I had to go through and remodel it. So I was always wondering if there was a better way to do that. Looks like people are populating. Looks like we got...
Yeah, most of the same softwares, or everything we've really talked about so far. A few people talking about 3ds Max. I'm wondering if we're seeing any civil software out there. And obviously shout outs to Flux before it went down. Yeah,
definitely. They were doing some pretty awesome stuff for sure. So that's good. It's good we're hitting a lot of the same design tools that you guys are using mostly. So let's talk about the SketchUp to Mass family to Revit workflow, because I think this is probably, if you guys did any kind of Google search or YouTube search, this was the most common workflow that most firms had done. And it works from a background standpoint. And I can kind of show this process, I think. So let me get back to Revit, make sure that I kind of wanted to show some of this information live rather than just pointing to the PowerPoint. So if I actually go to, I'm going to open up a new mass family. So for those that are wondering, the process usually is that you would create a new conceptual mass family. And I'm just going to navigate to that. Looks like my link broke. That's all right. I can navigate to it manually.
So while Bill's working on that, I'll point out that the other reason, one of my big questions, why are we running this again? Because this is a pretty popular topic that keeps coming up over and over. It's actually one of our most viewed or actively reviewed videos that we have up there previously, and one of our most asked about set of workflows. So every so often we like to revisit this because sometimes things change and sometimes the fundamentals are the same, but we like to refresh this content just to get it out there because we know it's such a big pain point for the industry as a whole.
Definitely. No, it's a really good point. And I think, too, I was telling Corey, he was like, so what are you talking about today? And I was kind of explaining, like, I've kind of shown these workflows at different conferences, but individually. So I've shown, like, this Grasshopper to Revit workflow or SketchUp to Revit workflow, but I've never really kind of shown them all together collectively. So I think it's good to kind of show all of them collectively and then kind of show the pros and cons of each of them as well. So typically the process was is you start a new conceptual mass family, and then you can bring in this SketchUp file into your mass family, and then we're going to bring that mass family into Revit. So I'll kind of show that process. Let me see if I can grab one of my SketchUp files. Should be in...
You got your extension set to DWG.
That's it. Thank you, sir. What would I do without you? SketchUp. See, I would have floundered through that for a good like 26 seconds if you weren't like helping me out. So I appreciate that. Okay, so let's say like we have this this SketchUp file. I'm going to bring this into my mass family. And then what you can do is once it's brought in here, you can then bring this mass family into Revit. It's taking a really long time on this. We might shuffle through. We'll see how long this takes. So I can't bring in. There it is. Okay. So here's my SketchUp model. And then basically the process is you load this into your project family. So you can put it in this one here.
This is a really good workflow actually for dealing sometimes with doubly curved and complex geometries that might have been authored in a totally different software. One of the things you can do with this specific workflow is you can associate walls and other native components to the face of that imported geometry itself. So this workflow definitely has its use case, but it's not necessarily a direct interoperability. There is some sort of step in between, and that's something that is just to be sort of remembered for the specific scenario where you might have a complex geometry that you can't build natively for whatever reason. So there's still a good reason to use that workflow.
For sure. Yeah, that's a really good point. So like Corey was saying, any double curves. I know I did like a lot of canopies and things like that when I worked in architecture, and this workflow worked really good actually for a lot of that. The other thing is it's I know you have to have the show mass mode on when you bring it over, and it should be coming in, but it's not. That's a good one. Let's see, I wonder, it's not any of this stuff. I tested this before and it was showing, but it was a different mass family. So I'm going to move on from this one onto some of the more kind of some of the more advanced ones. This one specifically, when you go SketchUp to Mass to Revit, you basically still have to do this wall by face, roof by face, floor by face. So to Corey's point, that's really good from a massing to Revit model standpoint, but it's not necessarily great in the sense of when you have some of this planar stuff, when you're having to go through and do some of that, it's kind of repetitive.
It's also a very manual process. So if you have a SketchUp model or any other sort of model with a lot of components, recreating those inside of Revit takes a pretty good amount of time.
It's totally true, for sure. Okay, so let's look at a little more advanced topic, because I think most people already know that one anyways. It already exists. There's a lot of information, and I'll post like the data sets for this later, so you guys can go ahead and play with some of these and use some of this. So this is another example of kind of a more, this is also kind of my progression of working with some of these. So this one is trying to start looking at a Grasshopper to Revit workflow. Now, one of the reasons you would want to use Grasshopper is for the purposes of parametric modeling or dynamic modeling. And so this is a good example where I've just started to play around with this different kind of like office building. So I can have like different design options for this. The other thing I want to point out is that Grasshopper always kind of gets a bad rap for, oh, that's when you're doing a Gary project, you know, or you're doing some crazy bridge. And if you're doing all this crazy form finding where it's like really complex geometry, but you don't necessarily need that. Further, it's also extremely pragmatic from a data standpoint. A lot of people say like, well, Rhino is not BIM. Well, that's not true at all, because you actually are able to capture all of this data. So as an example, I have in here the itemized square footage of each floor, but I also have the total square footage. And so within this, I'm able to change, say, number of floors. And you'll see that the data updates in real time. So my itemized is updating as I change the number of floors, and my aggregate total is also updating. So from like a programmatic standpoint, this is extremely pragmatic in that sense. Further, if you wanted to start playing with, say, some more complex type of forms, you can totally do that. So in this one, I have, where I might have, instead of just a rectangle, kind of have like this polygon type of shape. I can go through, I can change the number of radii, not the number of radii, but the size of the radii. And it will, like, if I bring it too small, you'll start to lose it. But you can see when I get in bigger, I'm getting that information. And a lot of these tools, from now on, what I'm going to be talking about is using tools as a broker. So what I mean when I say that is it's basically like the handshake between one program and the next. And so over here, what I'm using is this tool called Hummingbird. And if you go to the extra tab, you can download this from the Rhino website. They have different add-ins and apps, and basically Hummingbird was authored by two guys. One of them I know is Martin Gutman, and one other gentleman. And basically what it does is it's able to take the data from Grasshopper and compartmentalize it and push it over to Revit. So in this example, what I've done is I've dropped in different components from Grasshopper. In here that we have like families, or we could have walls, or we could have floors. And I'm going to show the floor example because I think this one is really good. And I'm just going to double check. Yeah, I should have that. So the floors example, what I do is I hook this up, this Boolean, to push the information from Rhino over to Revit. So when I hit that Boolean, it's populating all of these, and it's writing them into a certain path. It's calling them a certain file. That's the file name that it's going to give them. And then the type of family that you want to use over on the Revit side. So then over on the Revit side, and this is left over from Dynamo, you guys will see this in just a second. But over on the Revit side, we're going to go to add-ins and then the Hummingbird Model Builder.
So again, what Bill's seeing in the background here is kind of like a ghost of the last thing he was working on in Dynamo. So it's not anything relevant to what we're talking about right now, but it's the result of having Dynamo open previously.
Is there a way to clear that out, do you know?
Closing everything down and opening it back up. I don't know if there's a better workflow, but that's typically what I do. Okay.
All right, so with this process, we have, and I was testing a little bit before, so that's what we're seeing. So in here we have this floor push. Okay, so that was from when I was building it from Grasshopper. What it's done is it's populated it in here based on my folder location and the file location. And so I could click process this. And what it's going to do is it's going to start building those floors in Revit. Let's see. Interesting. It's actually building the curtain wall. You know what I love about live presentations? Is that they never go right. That is incredible. It doesn't matter. For those of you that can appreciate the sentiment, like whenever we do a live presentation, whether in person or online, you always got to appreciate that it doesn't actually work when you're doing it. I love this.
So while that processes, and I'm not sure if we're going to stop the interoperability exercise, because that's actually a pretty good number of panels for it to rebuild. Again, you would never want to rebuild this yourself, so it's actually kind of a worthwhile exercise to see the fluidity to go between design softwares. Can you talk about the complexity of managing that Grasshopper model and making sure that you're sending in and using the interoperability tools correctly?
Yeah, so as part of that, it's actually, that's a really good point. It's garbage in, garbage out, the data that's associated to it. And so you want to make sure that when you're pushing the information from the model, that you can see like all of these are going into certain location, and that's super intentional. And that's really important for being able to get the information to come across. In here...
So to point out, one of the limitations with what Bill's getting at is that the author of the Dynamo or Grasshopper script in this scenario has to be the one who's responsible for the interoperability exercise as well. And the challenge there is that, one, not everyone who is authoring the design itself in another platform is going to be the same person responsible for bringing it back into the Revit environment itself. So there is a sort of disconnect between who can actually use these softwares. And the idea, and a lot of the reasons why you see other softwares being more or less successful, is because they sort of democratize that sort of access, so that anyone can have equal access to the design software, and then it can be processed really quickly into the documentation or the BIM software itself. So that's one of the big ideas here, is how can we make it easier to provide anyone access to use interoperability tools. Grasshopper and Hummingbird are very exclusive tools that require a high level of skill and proficiency to implement correctly.
Definitely, it's a really good point. So I closed out of that, and I want to see if we open it back up. Promise this works. In here specifically, you want to make sure that you're bringing in the right information. So I had 2 example data sets in here, where it's basically, to Corey's point, was the curtain wall coming around, but then also the floor. And so the floor information was the information that I was trying to pull across. It definitely should bring that over, and be able to populate correctly. The other thing to note as part of this workflow that's the huge value add is that it's real Revit geometry. Okay, so it's not just a mass, not some dumb data background or anything like that. It's going to be actual real geometry. So in the example of this curtain panel, this is actually a 4-point adaptive component. And so I can go through, edit that family, and it's actually the information that was coming across from Rhino over to Revit as a curtain wall 4-point panel. Not necessarily a Revit curtain wall, but an adaptive component. And so this information is really good when you're trying to have super complex geometry, specifically triangulated geometry or double-edged curves, things like that. Super valuable for some of that kind of form rationalization and form finding. So with this, I'm going to double check just to see what I did.
I think it might be helpful when you open it up and bring in from, I think it's the add-ins tab, that model builder, if you could talk through some of the dialog options and settings that come up. What is it that you're looking at when you're trying to connect this Grasshopper geometry with a very specific option that you're trying to recreate in the model itself?
Definitely. So in here you have a few different settings. Specifically, you can add new elements or keep some of the other existing elements. Basically creates a synchronization between the two. That way it only changes the elements that changed, or you can just add all new elements. The other thing you can do is delete all the elements that existed before and then make new elements as well. So since we're doing this for the first time, I'm just saying add new elements. I'm really tempted to do this floor push again, and this shouldn't matter. Like, as long as you do floor push, this should totally work. I'm going to try one more time and see.
Is your path set to the correct?
Yep, should be. Totally. Yeah, that's a good question. Let's double check in Rhino. So in here we go to floors, and this is called a panel. It looks like maybe that was the issue. I think you're right. So this is a good example. No, it's there. It's right. It's going to the right one. So let's just try this one more time. If it doesn't work, we're going to move on to the next example. But I wanted to show this because I think it's good to show the systems part of it. So before, what I should have been doing is doing an adaptive curtain panel. That would have been the example before. Maybe it's just kind of like ghosted. Let's see if we do floor push. This definitely should work if I do floor push. And there we go. Boom.
Nice.
I don't know what happened before. Okay. So this is good. So this just kind of shows you guys the process. We, by are no means perfect either, and still trying to make sure all of this is dialed in. Okay, so here I have my floor push, and the big thing that I wanted to show you guys that I think is really, really important is that this is real Revit geometry, right? Again, so we're looking at the curtain panel, but this is also a real Revit floor, and so we get our sketch. When I edit this thing, and I can update it, and if I finish it, if you make it so it can close, went just a little too big.
So one of the other good things, and correct me if I'm wrong about this, is Hummingbird free? How is that available? How do you access it? How would I use this at my firm?
Yes, Hummingbird is open source, totally free. If anyone ever wanted to grab it, there's no monetary contributions to it at all. They're super generous in giving this out to the public and being able to use it. So absolutely free. So you can see here, real Revit geometry, real Revit floors, real adaptive components, all coming from this Rhino model. And so that's the process. You can create this building and then create all the different systems downstream that you want to push it into, and then it can populate that geometry.
Again, the nuance here is that it takes a really sophisticated Rhino Grasshopper user to implement this workflow.
Totally.
But what's nice about it is it totally supplants any other workflow that you might need going through Dynamo or something like that to help consume the information.
Yep, really good point. All right, so now we're going to move on to FormIt. So we're looking at the SketchUp to Mass workflow. We're looking at the Grasshopper to Revit workflow. Now we're going to look at FormIt. Now FormIt was kind of like a competitor to SketchUp that Autodesk had come out with. And it had some pretty cool utilities in it that I think were really beneficial, specifically the integration with parametricism from Dynamo. And so what I had done before, and this is what you guys were kind of seeing ghosted before, in here was this Dynamo script that I had. And I'll kind of show you guys how this is working. Now, you have to have Dynamo Studio, which I'm not going to show that piece of it, but you basically are able to take that information and publish it to the web from Dynamo, and then you can bring that geometry into FormIt to be able to interact with in the FormIt environment. And so while that's opening up, I'm going to just kind of show how this works. So I have regular geometry, but then I have what I'll call parametric geometry. And this fin facade right here was basically an example of something that I built in Dynamo. And then what I'm able to do is embellish that Dynamo information into the FormIt environment. So when I go through here and I update this, you'll notice that it thinks for a second and then the fin updates.
So did you build this as a Dynamo script first and then connected that script to FormIt, or did you build this in FormIt first and connect it to Dynamo after the fact?
I did a little bit of both. And so the example I was going to show is in the Dynamo world. I'll open this up. So basically Dynamo accepts SAT files, and within that SAT file I can link it in as a background, and I can scale that information, but I can also bring this information directly into Revit, or into FormIt rather. So in here what I had was an SAT, and I'm able to bring that information from an SAT file in Dynamo and interact with it in here. And then so like if I hit run, we should be able to see our facade update. Oh, and I actually wanted to unconnect this real quick. Just kind of show you guys how this could populate in the Revit world. Basically, I have two things going on here. Is I have form finding, I'm grabbing an SAT file, and I'm also pushing it into Revit as well.
And while that's thinking, I kind of want to ask one more follow-up question about the FormIt side. So is this dialog box that you're seeing on the right with all the properties, is that the same parameters as you're typically working with inside of that Dynamo script? How is that relationship between the elements?
Yeah, really good question. So over here to the right, they have this little Dynamo icon. And in here, you can actually start to grab different Dynamo scripts that you've published to the web using Dynamo Studio. And with this information, bring it into your FormIt model as a kind of dynamic facade or dynamic programmatic information. And so these are different ones that I personally have published to the web, and then am able to then bring into FormIt and interact with them.
So a good workflow example of this would be, I could, as a computational designer, build a Dynamo script that does or creates the desired result that we're hoping for, and then I could collaborate with the design director and let them manipulate the exact specifics of each parameter and each control without having to teach them how to work with Dynamo.
Totally, which I think that's a really good point, really, really valid point. So yeah, people don't necessarily need to know how to use visual programming or use Dynamo to interact with this. You could just publish it and then they're able to interact with it. Another good example is like for clients. There's a lot of architects, a trend I've been seeing is that they'll publish a lot of this stuff to the web and then they'll share it with their client. Their client can interact with it in this environment that you're seeing right now. So this is kind of, I don't know if you guys are noticing it, but the interaction between all of these programs is kind of starting to blur the lines, you know, whether it's Dynamo, FormIt, Revit, Grasshopper, it's kind of starting, everything's kind of becoming blurry a little bit, and we're going to see that, I think, more and more, in my personal opinion, as we move forward in the industry. Okay, so in here, I can go ahead and once I get kind of a design that I want, I can go ahead and save this sketch. Now, I can either save it to A360 or I can save it locally. And so if I save it locally, what I can do is save this information and then bring that into Revit and be able to start interacting with it. And I kind of want to show that environment first before I kind of show how you can interact with it on the Dynamo side.
And we did just get a really good question about, is this way of interacting with Dynamo and FormIt going away? The suggestion being that maybe Autodesk is already cutting this workflow in favor of some other workflow. Have you heard anything about that?
Yeah, so there are rumblings. They've been talking about a tool called Quantum, and it's basically supposed to be this bespoke solution that goes between all these different programs. If you guys saw AU a few years ago, that was a big deal. And so we're still waiting to see what's happening with some of that, and haven't seen anything pop up yet, or at least I haven't seen it personally. But there are rumblings about that coming into fruition. So, okay, so what I can do, I'll show you guys this process because I'm kind of going through it. Under the Add-ins tab, they have this Import FormIt to Revit. And so you can go Import FormIt to Revit, and then you go grab your FormIt file, okay? So in here I have different FormIt files. This AXM is that. And so I'll say Open.
And if you had different design options, would you have different files here, or?
Yeah, so if I saved out different FormIt files, I could bring in different FormIt options into Revit to be able to start going from. The thing that you guys will probably notice about this workflow is that it's very similar to the SketchUp to Revit one. You're basically bringing in a FormIt Mass to a Revit Mass, and then from there, you're starting to wall by face, floor by face, roof by face, that mass in the Revit environment.
And that's really less about SketchUp to Revit workflow as more a DWG to Revit workflow, so a 3D DWG file being brought in.
Yeah, and
because I say that because what we're going to show next is a native component that's an automated process to go from SketchUp to Revit. So I don't want to confuse people thinking that that's the only way to go from SketchUp to Revit. But that is a great way, what we showed very first, just importing the DWG into a mass family and loading that in. That's a great way to deal with any DWG file type.
Definitely. It's a really good point. You've been working on a workflow recently, kind of doing DWG to Revit. Do you want to talk about that at all, or?
Not in particular. I think the ability, and so I teach at a university as well, and one of the first things I always am sure to teach my students is that you should never use the import DWG option in Revit unless you're going into a linked family or a linked file or a family itself that you're bringing in. The reason I don't like importing DWG files is because it loses the flexibility and the ability to change elements. So because, for a lot of reasons, my description here is that because Revit doesn't really have the ability to control layers in the same way, once you import that DWG, you lose the ability to manipulate anything in the background image. So it's kind of like when you're working in Photoshop, you shouldn't do anything destructive to that background JPEG or whatever sort of TIFF you might be working with. You always want to be manipulating the geometry in the DWG world inside of AutoCAD, and then linking that back in so you can have that sort of file structure and the integrity of the layers maintained. It just makes it a more fluid, long-term way to continuously improve your background information. I think there's this big misunderstanding that once something comes into Revit, it's in Revit forever, and that's just not the case. So the design process isn't that static, and you have this constant back and forth, and that's one of the reasons why I think importing DWG files is a really bad practice. But if anyone can, put into the comment box a good use case for why you'd want to import a DWG file, I'd love to be wrong on this.
That's good. Really good point. All right, so we got our FormIt model that we brought into Revit using the add-ins from FormIt. And again, this is kind of like the broker between the two. And then the next process would be basically going to the wall by face tool and going and selecting your walls. And it looks like I already picked one there, or doing a roof by face. And so from there, what I'm doing is I'm basically doing that same process I was doing before. If I go ahead and delete this, you'll see that I actually still have my walls and my roofs. And what it's doing is it's the same process that you would do from your SketchUp to family to Revit workflow. You're bringing in a mass, wall by face, roof by face, and then massing it out. Again, I'm not particularly excited about these workflows just because there's so much manual effort that exists of having to click all these different faces, and it's not quite dynamic. So That's kind of the downside of those two workflows. The last one, no, I wanted to show the Revit Dynamo one. So the other one that I was working on, let's see if Dynamo will fire up. Looks like it's kind of frozen.
So I think as that's processing, I'll respond to another good comment that we saw in the chat box, which was in addition to the staticness of the DWG once it's imported, it also brings in all the line types and line styles. So there's one consulting engagement that I worked with years ago. They were doing 3 things that were just like destroying their models, and they were having such latency issues. And one of them was they had imported a bunch of DWGs in the background for their landscape or their topo, and essentially what had happened is they brought in probably somewhere around order of magnitude 4,000 line styles.
Holy smokes.
So in addition to that, they also inserted images into their construction set of all the high resolution images, so much so that they had about I think 40 full page high resolution images inserted into their sheets themselves, so when they reproduced their set, that those renderings would actually be automatically recreated. And what ended up happening is after purging those 2 things out of their model itself, and suggesting using something like Illustrator or InDesign for manipulating the renderings and all of that, we were able to cut their file size in half and increase the model performance so that it was actually responsive rather than having all these really long delays and latency issues caused by importing DWGs. It's just a really bad practice. So thanks for pointing that out, Andrew.
Really good. What else are people talking about in there while we're waiting for Revit to crash and reopen?
Yeah, really, we've kind of covered everything at this point. I'm wondering if anyone has any specific questions or parts of the workflow that we've covered that you want us to talk more about, or any other use cases that you've seen have been really helpful in previous exercises.
Yeah, so while you guys are doing that, I'm going to open up Revit here. Again, some of the pros and cons to talk about is getting the information as native Revit geometry versus a mass. I think those are really good points to kind of talk about as it relates to some of these pros and cons. We'd love to hear your guys' points and questions and comments as far as challenges you guys have run into as it relates to this workflow or otherwise.
So one of the things that we've been looking a lot at is we have a lot of manufacturing clients where they're trying to control the supply chain of their shop with the fabrication chain of their design team and their production teams, and they're using all these different softwares and QR codes to help better connect what is happening at an early stage design with what's actually being run off of the floor of their shop itself. And we're seeing a lot of really cool tools, but we haven't seen any sort of silver bullet yet, that any one software seems to be the right answer, because so many workflows are so customized to what each firm is doing.
It's a good, really, really good point.
And especially a lot of the manufacturing firms that we've worked with, we've seen they're more dependent on a product like a CATIA or a Dassault system, any of the ecosystem that they have in regard to their 3D experience software. And I know this is the same even with car manufacturing and other automated worlds.
Really good point. This is crazy. Longest opening of Revit ever. Of course, it's when we're doing it live.
So let's see if the presentation part itself works, because
yeah,
that could be a good part to supplement here.
Yeah, for sure. So while that's opening, I'm going to kind of talk about this process too as this Grasshopper to Revit workflow. Specifically, some real-world examples would be this Breckenridge parking garage. So in here, basically the process was to go through and do the same process we said before, as far as you kind of build this geometric information in Rhino and Grasshopper. And so you have the skin, it's updating, able to update that information in real time versus having to build something, save as, build something, save as. You can kind of dynamically update this. And then we're using this as again, Hummingbird as that broker between the two programs to push over. So I thought this would be a good example as well to kind of talk about like a real case example. So it's not just pie in the sky, fluffy stuff. It's a real case example. And again, as we click those are adaptive components that exist over in the Revit world.
And so a good conversation is happening in the chat as well right now, talking about how frequently all this stuff crashes. And all the time, which makes for a very good best practice. Well, when should I save my file? And specifically to the Dynamo side of things, should I be set to automatic or set to run? And I never have my automatic run set. I have it always switched to manual. It's the same thing with Grasshopper. I will try and freeze my canvas whenever possible, because sometimes these softwares just behave totally erratically, and sometimes they behave perfectly. One of the challenges around that, especially in regard to Dynamo, is, well, how can I use Dynamo Player to create these sorts of definitions that are really reliable and resilient to not have that issue? And that's actually one of the biggest challenges we face as Evolve Lab when we try to deploy custom Dynamo scripts or custom workflows that have a specific client-facing need. How do we make sure that this doesn't fail, and what are our fail-safes that we can build to make sure that it sort of kicks out rather going into an infinite loop?
It's a really good point. The only example I would say of where I use the automatic is if I'm trying to do some kind of form finding in Dynamo, so that if I'm updating my nodes, either my integers or anything else, that it's updating in real time. But for the example of like pushing geometry, definitely have that set to manual, and only when you're ready to actually push it. So,
and even so, I'll challenge on that a little bit too, because the design process for me isn't running automatically. And so there are those sorts of fluidity that I can click run. I don't need it to automatically run for me. Clicking run myself is an okay workflow, because really the fluidity of the automatic behavior is really just something I need to use when I'm trying to impress people with the Dynamo script making a change. Otherwise, it's mostly pretty static in my opinion, that design process.
It's a really good point. So I'm going to show this other workflow. The Dynamo one I think is taking a while, so I'll try to post that separately. But the nice thing about the Dynamo workflow was that it was also populating the adaptive components. So rather than just having those fins be as static geometry, they'd actually populate the adaptive component, which we already kind of saw with the glass from Grasshopper to Revit. So I think you guys get a pretty good sense of how that works. You can do the same thing on the Dynamo side, which probably begs the question maybe some of you guys are asking, well, why use Grasshopper if I could just use Dynamo? In my opinion, one of the things that's nice about it is that it is a little more robust than Dynamo, in my opinion, especially on the form finding side. The graph mappers, things like that, are already native within the program. You don't need any extra packages. So all of that is really helpful on that side. So that's one reason to use Grasshopper. I mean, you use Grasshopper and Dynamo. Do you have an opinion of like when to use one versus the other?
Yeah, so I stopped using Grasshopper about 2 years ago because I just don't. I like Grasshopper. It's how I got introduced to visual programming. There isn't anything I need to do in Grasshopper that I wouldn't just be able to do in Dynamo. That's also a reflection on what sort of work I've been doing for the last 2 years, though. I'm not saying that Grasshopper doesn't have its use cases. I just haven't really had a need for it because Dynamo's access to Revit's API is so much more potent than any form finding that I might want to do inside of Grasshopper. But when it comes to iterative or the extra tool sets and the automation routines that are out there for Grasshopper, I think that open source community is much more powerful and robust. I just haven't really been using it as frequently because I've been really impressed with Dynamo's power itself. And to address one of the things that's coming up is that a lot of people are going to creating their own custom add-ins and just programming directly in C or C# or whatever the platform is. And I think that's a totally, completely appropriate workflow. As consultants, one of the things that we find and we're really concerned about is how do we fix this if/when it breaks, because it's almost always going to break. And for our clients, it's more important that they're able to make that fix themselves rather than reach out to us and have to rely on us to make those sorts of updates. We always want to make that update and make sure we're delivering a great product, but sometimes things have to be adapted and new features have to be created and rolled in. And we found that Dynamo is a better tool for that because it doesn't require this sort of exclusive programming ability. And it's more accessible, it's more about that idea of democratizing interoperability and automations so that more users can use them.
It's a really good point. So the other thing we're going to talk about now is kind of this SketchUp to Revit workflow of converting this information to real native Revit geometry. And so as part of this, just like full disclosure, I may like totally lose some of you guys on this. I was super anti-SketchUp when I was a BIM manager. So I worked at HDR for a number of years and Oz and Lansbogio, and was super kind of anti-SketchUp just because of the model drop chasm that existed. and was not able to get the information in there natively. I since have been like switched to the other side. My pendulum has swung just because I've recognized that the industry, and this is kind of like more of a philosophical comment or question than it is anything else, is that the entire industry is not going to stop using SketchUp. And so as part of that, I decided as like we have to do something for this workflow to get over this kind of model drop chasm. And since then, what we've designed and developed is a tool called Helix. And Helix allows you to convert SketchUp information to real native Revit geometry. And so within here, basically the process is you sync your walls, windows, doors, roofs, curtain wall types from your template, from your company's template. This is the secret sauce now. It's using your guys' native information, which is pretty cool. So you'll hit sync. I won't do that right now because it does take a little while. Once you hit sync, that information becomes readily available over on the SketchUp side. So I'll show how this process kind of works.
And what we're getting as if you've authored software, if you've authored a design in SketchUp, or if you've authored the core part of a core and shell model in Revit, you can bring that core and shell model back to SketchUp. Is that correct?
Yep.
And so then the workflow here might be your interior design team or your interior architecture or your environmental branding team might be working in SketchUp, and they need to have this background so they can start to do things like placing interior partitions or furniture objects or lighting elements. And so this Helix workflow is supposed to really help facilitate that exchange between design teams in a much more fluid way. And that's hopefully what we're going to get to now, which is how do you bring something that's been modeled in SketchUp back into the Revit environment? How does that workflow and remapping of elements work?
Yeah, and I think something too, Corey and I were just talking about this before we started, is that all of the workflows you guys have seen so far primarily have been showing some form of visual programming, some kind of Dynamo, some kind of Revit, some kind of Grasshopper. And so in there's been a lot of kind of computational pieces of it. And we were super intentional and strategic when developing Helix that we didn't want that visual programming aspect, not because we don't like that and not because we don't think people shouldn't be using it, but typically we wanted it to try to make it more palatable for people that are not computational designers.
So let's see it in action.
Yeah, so in here, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and take this window out and this brick wall so you guys can kind of see the process for how you would send these to be mapped and to componentize them.
And describe the map components dialog that's up now.
Yeah, so this right here is the Helix user interface. And what we wanted to try to do is it's basically a fancy mapping tool. And what we want to do is bring the information from the SketchUp model into this interface so that way we can map it and send it over to Revit.
And what you're seeing inside of this dialog are all the components that are already inside of the Revit model, and as far as wall types and door types and window types. So this is all the information that results from when you sync that initial step.
Yeah, and we'll see that in just 1 second. So in here, if I click on this brick wall, I can say send to be mapped. And what it's going to do is it's going to pop up in this uncategorized portion. Similarly, I'm going to click on this window and I'll say send to be mapped. And you'll see it pop up in the uncategorized portion. Now, what I do now is I tell it it is a window because it doesn't know, just like AutoCAD, it doesn't know what it is. And I can tell this guy that it's a wall. And then once I tell it what it is, I can then say, hey, you are white brick on metal stud. Now to Corey's point just a minute ago, these are all of your native Revit wall types that exist in the program. So you don't have to go through and put in a text box of what wall type. You can just pick it and it brings it over on the SketchUp side, pick it, and then that's what it is. And the other nice thing about this, I don't know if you guys noticed, the other difference between the workflows we were showing before is all this aggregation of data. With the Grasshopper side, I had to point and push at certain places of all of the model collectively. With this one, I just mapped this one face. Now all the other 3 sides are mapped. With the window, I just mapped this one window. I'll go ahead and tell this one it's casement with trim, 24 by 72. Now I've mapped all 15 or how many ever window types that are on here. I've mapped those, so all of these collectively are mapped.
And those windows inside are just kind of components that have been placed one at a time through the model, correct?
Correct.
And so a use case here might be if you have a certain chair or a certain table that's been built as a SketchUp component, all you have to do is, quote, map that a single time using the Helix interface. Then when you run that interoperability export, it will actually automatically push everything directly from SketchUp into your native BIM environment.
Correct. Yeah, so I just did that. I hit export. You can see it went through, exported it. And then over on the Revit side, I'll go to import. Let me close this just to make sure. And we'll launch Helix again. And then this time I'll say import elements from SketchUp. And when I'm importing it, it's literally going to start drawing for me in the Revit environment all the walls, the doors, the windows, the roof, the curtain wall, all of that information as native Revit information.
So these are components, the walls themselves, that can be stretched.
Correct. Yeah. So in a second here, for some reason the computer's running really slow, but once it's done completing this, it'll actually be a native Revit wall type that we can go through, click that element, edit profile, just like we did with the floors for the Grasshopper example. Similarly, I'll show you guys all of the windows are schedulable. They're your guys' windows that work in your guys' ecosystem, your environment at your firm, not ours, not any other firms. When you sync it over, it's your information. So all of those components work natively with your window schedules, with your doors, etc.
And so you can see what looked like a sort of blue wheel of death was really just the model processing in the background. So it's not that SketchUp or the Helix add-in was failing, it was just kind of processing the information and gives you this completely finished resultant.
Exactly. So then over here, if we now open up this window, yeah, I was just showing Corey this, and I still am just like so geeked out about this that we can do this, is that it's not just some dumb mass that exists in the Revit world. When I go to the floor plan, you can see like it has all of your guys' parameters that you guys have authored parametrically. It has any of the data that's associated to it within that window family. Similarly, the walls, like Corey was just talking about, if I go to the wall and I hit edit profile, it's going to be a native Revit wall type. It's not going to be some masked thing that comes over.
So I want to demystify a few things that are happening here. Right now, that exchange is happening based on essentially the insertion point of the family. So the geometry that you've modeled in SketchUp doesn't have to reflect the exact same geometry or amount of detail that you've modeled in your Revit.rfa. So that .rfa you might model 2 years ago, but you're still using that same door family. Well, all you need to do on the SketchUp side is have a component that has, as you can see in Bill's window on the left, the insertion point essentially at the bottom left side of that that component, and the Helix workflow is exchanging that point back and forth.
It's good. So that's kind of the workflow here. The other thing we can do is also bring that from the Revit environment back to SketchUp as well. I'm not going to do that just for demonstration purposes because it does take a little bit of time. But if you wanted to, you could open up the dialog box here for Helix.
And some of the components, when they get brought in, they might not create that sort of remapped native Revit geometry. In some scenarios, if it's a really complex form, it might actually just create an in-place geometry. Is that correct? Can you talk through that?
Yeah, so the other thing it's able to do is other elements that are not just walls, doors, windows, roofs, and curtain walls. So like as an example, I could have, say, a lighting fixture. And I haven't tested it in this one. We could give it a go. But because it's taken a little while, I might not. In here, I'm also able to map other kind of auxiliary components that are not a wall, door, window, roof, or curtain wall. Because this was something that was also a lot of people were asking for. And if you do that, it'll fall into this other category, and you can bring it over as what Revit calls as a direct shape. So there is the ability to be able to do that, as well as the shell of the building. So furniture, information like that, you're able to bring over as well. And as mentioned, you can also go bidirectional. You can go back from Revit to SketchUp as well.
And so that's kind of hopefully an answer to one of the questions that came up in the dialogue, is can you do this process in reverse? Can you start in Revit as a native element and then build out a model in SketchUp? And the answer is absolutely yes.
For sure. Really good point. With that, we're closing out. Want to just give a big shout out for our membership. For those that don't know, membership is totally free. If anyone is ever interested in learning more about these workflows, I actually have one on our membership. It talks about pushing Grasshopper geometry into Revit. Rather than giving Grasshopper like a 10-15 minute window, I go through the whole hour of showing how to format your data, how it needs to be brought into Revit, how to create those adaptive components so that it can come over the floors, etc. So really more of an exhaustive way to do that. We have a bunch of free scripts, Excel and Revit interoperability. So we call this the data drop chasm between those two programs. We have scripts that are able to do that, as well as some kind of attractors and other kind of random curtain wall scripts. Quite a few out there that are available, as well as our forum, our Slack channel. All of those are available for you guys. We really try to provide those to anyone that's interested in learning more about some of these tools. I want to take advantage of some of these kind of computational efforts.
And then another thing that's not in this presentation is, as 2019 kicked off, we just deployed an update to our website that we're really proud of, and we're really impressed with the hard work that both Cassie and Daniel did putting this together, making sure that everything's a little bit more productized, right? And one of the things that we're trying to do is democratize access to advanced tools and workflows. And some of those things that we're going to be putting out in the future are going to be showing up on our website under the products page. And it has a lot of really great content on the website, so it takes a little bit of time to load. We've got a lot of embedded GIFs and videos showing how all this stuff works. But we've got these new sorts of content libraries, Dynamo scripts, as well as other workflows that are up here for purchase or free download. It just kind of depends on what it is that you're trying to look at. So feel free to get kicked over to this, check it out. We'll put a link in the message box so anyone can sort of follow that link pretty easily.
Definitely. And then finally, like if there's anything that you guys need help with, we do have our subscription as well. And basically that's like an on-demand, as-needed BIM manager. So if you guys are looking to try to learn Dynamo, you're going out to Atlanta next week. You're going to be doing a Dynamo workshop.
So I'm going to Atlanta next week to do a Dynamo workshop, and then we're going to be doing, I think, a Dynamo user group at some point next month here in Denver or Boulder.
Denver. In Denver, yep. But if you guys are interested in having one of us come out to your guys' firm, doing a Dynamo workshop, you guys want to learn more about that, or if you guys have projects that need some kind of interoperability between Grasshopper and Revit or SketchUp and Revit, and you guys just have questions about that, reach out to us. But that's really what the subscription is for, to be able to give you guys the resources that you need on project examples. So with that, that's all I have to share. We are at the top of the hour. Is there anything else, Jerry Springer's final thoughts that you have?
Definitely not. No,
okay. Okay.
Thanks for joining us. Thanks for watching. Hopefully we'll catch you guys on the next one.
Yep. Take care, guys. See you later.
Cheers.
Bye-bye.